All right, so the Electoral Amendment Bill has now been signed into law by the President. The Act allows independent candidates to stand in provincial and national elections from next year. I'm joined now by Mudzuli Rakhivhane, who is the head of candidate recruitment at the newly formed political party Build One SA. Thank you so much for joining us. We listened to the IEC, their briefing just a little earlier this evening, and this is going to have a material impact on the 2024 elections. We're going to see potentially independent candidates standing for a seat in a provincial legislature or even as a member of parliament in our National Assembly. Why is this an important step?
Well, I think it's important for a few reasons. Number one, this comes as a result of the Constitutional Court judgment a few years ago in New Nation, where the Constitutional Court said that it's actually a violation of people's freedom of association to be forced to run as candidates through political parties. So there's a constitutional aspect to it through the judgment, but from a broader sort of democratic reason, it's a really good step in theory in the right direction that independent candidates should be able to stand. And sometimes the conversation can get weird about independent candidacy being the be-all and end-all of it. But that's not the point of it. The point of it, number one, if done properly, it actually allows for South Africans to directly elect leaders. They know their names, their faces, their CVs, and it creates a better chain of accountability between the people that you're representing and the leaders. So if it's done correctly, it has the power actually to impact things like accountability and corruption, but more than that, it actually takes us closer to our constitutional values about responsiveness, about openness, accountability, transparency, because it's actually just a gateway for closer, more responsive, direct democracy.
And listening to the IEC briefing, they were explaining what an individual needs to do to get onto the ballot sheet. I wonder if you could just break it down for us and whether you at Build One SA believe that this is a fair system, because there's been a lot of criticism of this bill, that it wasn't loading the dice, it was loading the dice against individuals. Do you feel that that has largely been sorted out now and they have a fighting chance against these political parties with all their muscle and all their supporters?
Yeah, so I will say this, we have made significant progress from where the bill started to where it is, but as it is, it's still inherently stacked up against independent candidates. And it seems as if Parliament has basically decided to create an act which is basically made to protect parties. And I'll use a few examples. Number one, if I wanted to start a political party, which it seems like everyone is doing these days, I would have required, before this act, only 1,000 signatures nationally to go to the IEC and say, well, I have support base of 1,000 people, register me. The new act would require independent candidates to get 15% of the previous vote requirement to get a seat. In real numbers, that looks like anywhere between 11,000 signatures and 14,000 signatures. So Parliament needs to be able to explain to us why the jump between 1,000 signatures and suddenly 11 to 14,000 signatures, when 1,000 signatures has been sufficient since the beginning of our democracy. Another example is that independent candidates, as it stands, would almost need to get double the amount of votes that a political party would need to get for exactly the same seat. And that's largely because Parliament has reserved 200 seats exclusively for political parties and only allows independent candidates to contest for 200 seats in Parliament. So Parliament's made up of 400 seats, 200 is exclusively reserved for political parties, and then the other 200 independent candidates and parties will need to fight that out. And the consequence of that is not only is it unfair that candidates don't have access to all 400 seats, but it also then has an impact on the thresholds that they need to meet for exactly the same seat with the same power as a political party.
Does this mean that this act could be open to legal challenge before the 2024 election?
Absolutely. I think there's no secret about it. There are a number of organizations who have already prepared for this moment and are gearing to approach the Constitutional Court on an urgent and a direct basis in order to challenge this. And part of the unfortunate sequence of events here is that Parliament took forever to enact or to present the bill to the president. They took the 24 months that they were given and then received 2 extensions on top of that. Then we had to wait a couple of weeks for the president to sign the bill. And the consequence of that is now that there's a extreme time pressure, as you would have heard from the IEC's briefing that they themselves have admitted, that we actually need a finalization of this because the elections are getting closer and closer if they're expected to be held out in May. And more so, the Constitutional Court has already told us in the local government election saga that they are unwilling to extend elections. So there's a grace period which the Constitution gives the IEC essentially to run an election. But what we're not going to have is the Constitutional Court to delay an election because of this electoral amendment mess. And it would have been great had Parliament actually taken all these organizations and parties into their confidence to try to resolve the issues rather than drag out their own processes and then also force now late litigation so close to an election.
Does it mean that any legal challenge might, as you said, can't delay the election, but could it mean that effectively government goes, well, the IEC goes, well, we can't actually include the independent candidates this year, or are they legally bound to have independent candidates in the 2024 poll, come what may?
Yeah, we would say that they're legally bound because the Constitutional Court has already made a decision and said that it's unconstitutional for independent candidates to not be allowed. So you'd appreciate that that creates quite a tricky situation because the court can't go back on its unconstitutional route or unconstitutionality. Because then I'd assume the next step for someone the day after the election would be to knock on the IEC's door, the court's door, and say, well, you ran an election without independent candidates. That's unconstitutional. There goes your election, null and void, a couple of $100 million that we spent. And there's nothing worse in a democracy when you're starting to challenge the results of an election. We've seen what that can do in the US and countries world over. So the worst thing you want is there to be questions around the constitutionality of an election because of the.
So talk to me about Build One South Africa. It is my understanding it's an umbrella body that pulls together independents to provide them support. What does this mean for candidates who are part of Build One South Africa? Because you're not essentially saying we're a political party. We can't. My understanding is you cannot take advantage of that proportional representation, or can you? Just explain the implications to me.
So in a lot of ways, we actually saw this coming, and that's why we created this vehicle as a safeguard to knowing that the bill wasn't going to turn out the way we actually wanted it to, so that independents could run out and out by themselves. So what we've done is created an umbrella body to say that if your intention actually was to stand as an independent, if you're a community leader and you don't really want to be part of like nonsensical, sometimes party politics, if you are in business or if you are in sectors and industries and you actually want to take a step into the political realm, here's a body for you to do that, because it's actually not advisable, frankly, at this juncture, to go it on your own. It's going to be extremely difficult, even from a signature requirement, from a vote requirement, from a money requirement. So rather we pull those resources together, we provide you support, as we've done in the local government election with smaller organizations, and then we help you to run. And the benefit of that is that you actually will benefit from the PR vote because we are registered with the IEC. So we would run it as endorsing essentially a group and a conglomerate of candidates. But from the IEC's perspective, you are actually a party that enables you to benefit from the PR system. And that becomes incredibly critical because one of the things you might have heard the IEC speak about today, which is extremely problematic, is that they've allowed for independents to run essentially in every province. So I am a candidate and I want to run in the Western Cape, Northern Cape, and Gauteng because that's where I believe my voter base is. I get 15,000 votes across each province, but the threshold to get one seat is 20,000 votes. So as the bill stands now, I won't get a seat because I didn't meet that threshold in a particular province. And additionally, I'm unable to aggregate my votes across the country in the places that I stood. But if I was in a political party, I'd be able to aggregate the votes that I got across the different provinces, and then I would get my seat. So in a lot of ways, what WASA has actually done is become a foolproof and a safe proof for some of the sort of nonsensical errors that have come up in the Electoral Amendment Bill.
Well, you've explained it all so well. Really do appreciate your time. Thank you so very much for chatting to us. That is Mudzuli Rakhivhane. She is the head of candidate recruitment at the newly formed political party Build One SA. Of course, that was formed in September last year, but it's an umbrella body for independent candidates. All right.